Thanks to Breed and Claire and all the team at Aware for inviting me to come along this evening to talk to you on a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. I never have to be asked the second time if somebody says, will you come and do a talk for us? Because I'm really, really passionate and into this area. And I seize any opportunity just to get out there and to get a conversation going and to start discussing the issues around an area that really goes under the radar for the most part. And that's namely the role and the place of sexuality in thinking about mental health matters. So, me willing to talk and you here, and we're ready to go for the next little while. I'd like to just maybe give you a sense of what I hope to talk about this evening. I'll begin by talking about what do I mean when I talk about sexual health or psychosexual health, as you might hear me refer to it as. Then I will give a wee bit of time to considering how does our sexuality evolve, because that really plays a crucial part in understanding how might our sexuality and our experience of it have a part to play in good mental health and well-being. Then I'll go on and talk a little bit about some common sexual difficulties that arise and how they manage them, and I'll be thinking a little bit about my own practice in a service we have at St. John of God Hospital. And after that, I will look at what I call some hot topics, things that are very much out there in the media and in our attention, issues around social media and sexual well-being, issues around pornography and the implications of that, and offer you my thoughts about that. And to conclude, I will make some suggestions about how we all can work to ensure that we maintain good psychosexual health and well-being in our everydays. So, with that little agenda in mind, I'll begin. And I give you a caution, I'm not going to be hitting you with big wordy slides for the night, but I thought it would be really helpful to just highlight some aspects of this statement about what sexual health entails, coming from the World Health Organization 2012. And the few pieces of it in particular that I would like to tease out a bit. Really, this definition shows that sexual health isn't just about physical sexual health. And I think for too long that has been something of an error that has been made in the medical world, viewing sexual health purely as a physical issue. And what this definition does is it extends it right out beyond that and talks about the emotional, mental, social well-being of every person, and highlights how important it is to have positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships so that everybody is open to having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences, free of coercion, free of discrimination, free of violence. Really powerful, strong words that broadens the psychosexual issues into something very much more than physical sexual health. Talks about rights and that the rights of every person around their sexuality have to be respected. Now, these words ricochet all around the place because if you think about something like the sexual lives of people who have disability, or if you think about things like trafficking, or if you think about a whole host of different issues where people might be limited and constrained by the world we live in and the systems and the cultures that we live in, then these words have powerful things to say. But I suppose what I really want to highlight is this idea, moving beyond viewing psychosexual health as something physical into the social, emotional, cultural domains. Now, this is a wee model that I use in my own practice quite a lot. And I put it up here at the top of my thoughts tonight because I think it stretches on that point about the place of sexuality in our lives, that it isn't something narrow and restricted, and that it's something that if we're to think about it, we have to consider a whole host of other areas, and that within these other aspects of our lives, sexuality sits. it's interesting that in my own work, which is largely around supporting people who have psychosexual difficulties, that very often I find that the issues we're talking about are not sex and sexuality. We get there, but we're coming at it from all these other aspects of life that are relevant for an individual. So I thought it might be helpful to talk about a few people just to highlight what I mean by all of this. And I suppose I would say that in talking about any person here tonight, I'm obviously not talking about a specific person, but I'm talking more about people who are figments of my own imagination and based loosely on a whole host of different stories that I would have heard over the years. So the first person that I want to talk about is Anne, a 72-year-old lady who has had recurring and quite serious depression for a good number of years. Probably about 12 to 15 years she's been struggling with this. She experienced kind of the old empty nest syndrome, where her family had grown up and moved on and started lives of their own. And in the wake of that, what was very clear to Anne was the tensions in her own marital relationship, where herself and her husband didn't have a secure, solid relationship between them, and when they were left together, that vulnerability became very evident for her. Anne craved intimacy. Anne craved the basic things of touch, of friendship, of companionship, and she wasn't able to get those and found herself to be profoundly lonely. And arising from that, she became socially withdrawn, she became avoidant of doing regular things that she had been doing in her life, and her depression became quite entrenched and recurring. Now, I suppose if we think about someone like Anne against the little model that I introduced earlier, you can see that in yellow the key features of her experience. So she had psychological and relationship issues, but that bounced around all other aspects of her life, where her leisure activities, her involvement with her community, which would have been great, where her own health, but her sexuality and spirituality became impacted because of this. Another person is Brian, a very nice man who had experienced a lot of emotional turmoil during his teenage years, leading to being hospitalised and leading to disruption in his progression from adolescence into young adulthood, and his experience of low mood, poor coping, emotional vulnerability. And I suppose in the process of trying to deal with that as best he could with various supports, he struggled to establish the kind of peer relationships that would be typical at that stage during 20s, etc., and formed a belief that he was different, formed a belief that any time he had a relationship which ended after a period, that was a failed relationship. So during his 30s then, he became withdrawn, avoidant of relationships, unemployed, and just unable to get his life going in that respect, psychosocial respect. So again here, if we consider him in relation to the model I'm introducing, the two yellow stars highlighting again health, psychological, but that having implications at every other layer of his life. Finally, I think about Lady Zoe in her 50s, who is a woman married with teenage children, deeply committed to her family, to her children, to her husband, deeply committed, but deeply sad. Because within her, she's aware of a very big void and an issue to do with her sexuality that she has never really opened up and explored. And when she came to tell her story, she was able to say that in her early 20s, she went to her GP and discussed the possibility that she might be gay, and got the response from the GP that you'd need to think long and hard before you go into all of that. And at that stage, she shut down her discussion of her sexuality. She shut down any exploration of that and proceeded to lead the life she had. So found herself in her 50s with an alcohol addiction issue and with depression. So thinking about her story in the context of this, could very definitely say that sexuality was right at the core of her subsequent mental health and addiction issues. But again, implications around all the other areas of her life. So for any of these people, it's really difficult to say that sexuality is a direct issue or a problem that they need to address. Mental health becomes woven in through it, and you arrive at a point where it's almost like chicken and egg effect. Difficult to clearly say where the cause and the effect is. And maybe talking about cause and effect isn't that helpful. Maybe what's more helpful is to chat about the interplay between these things and to then go and tease that out and open up what issues are at play. I think there's an interesting dynamic interplay between how we view ourselves and our mental health. And when our mental health becomes compromised, how we view ourselves becomes a bit strained. We might develop negative thinking around ourselves. We might develop various beliefs that dictate how we see ourselves, that in turn impact on our mental health. And it's similar for our sense of sexual self. Whenever our mental health becomes strained, it can have a knock-on effect into our sense of ourselves as a sexual being, and vice versa. I thought it'd be interesting just to consider some of these figures from an Australian survey a number of years ago, which highlight just the implication of aspects of intimacy and sexuality on people who have mental health difficulties. First of all, about half of people who responded to this survey would have said that they didn't have any relationship that was meaningful for them in the 12 months prior to the survey. Now, that's not an intimate relationship that they're talking about. That's a relationship where they feel valued, where they feel loved, where they feel understood, where they feel respected. That's the kind of relationship with a good friend, with a family member who cares. It's not about sexuality per se. So there's a big void for those people. Thinking about intimacy, and again, not talking about sexual intimacy, purely intimacy of touch, a handshake, a hug, a gesture just to reassure. And here again, there is about 13% of people who hadn't experienced that in the previous 12 months. It might seem a small percentage, but for those people, that's a phenomenally important thing. For people around sexual intimacy, again, very low. I think it's 34% of people who would have said that they had a sexual experience in the year prior to the survey. And of course we know that for some people who struggle with mental health difficulties, sexual desire, libido can be reduced, medications can impact on that. But even so, this is a very small percentage of people who are reporting having a sexual, intimate relationship. Whenever I talk with groups like this, I usually look for a show of hands, asking people how comfortable they might be in talking about a sexual matter with a mental health professional. And don't worry, I'm not going to put you under pressure now. But the response that I typically get back is really interesting. Invariably, the majority of people will say that they're really uncomfortable with it. And the majority of people will say that they haven't really done it. Now, I suppose the reassurance for people in that is that they're very much in keeping with what research would say about that particular issue. People tend not to bring their sexual concerns to their mental health or to their medical practitioners' attention. But they do know they have it. They do know they have concerns, or they do know they have difficulties that they'd like to address. And they're waiting to be asked. And if asked, then they would be willing to go there. Now, the flip side of that is when I meet with groups of professionals of medical world people, of therapy world people, of psychologists like myself, and ask them how many of them have had specific training as part of their core training to become the professional that they are. The numbers will always be really, really small of people who say that. The profession that I know is to be most equipped with that type of training are psychotherapists. But us psychologists, medical people, nursing, social work, invariably have a very low experience of specific training about working and understanding sexuality with people. Now, I think that's a big issue. And I suppose that's one of the things that prompts me anytime there's a mic available to get up and to start doing something to try and address that. In this dynamic where people who have difficulties are waiting to be asked, and the people who should be doing the asking are a bit avoidant of it at best, it creates something of a kind of a cat and mouse game. And the really sad part is that for people it leaves psychosexual issues going unaddressed. What kind of a message does it give to somebody if I will sit and talk with somebody and ask them their whole life story, go through all sorts of details about their lives in my best efforts to try and support them, and I don't ask them about their sexuality that is core to who they are? It's not going probing, it's just, to get a sense of where people are at with that. What's the effect of that going to be for somebody? It communicates, this is a no-go area, we don't talk about this here, so, just keep quiet about it. And all the research would seem to suggest that people will very much take that unspoken message on board and won't go and ask the question. I think this image is kind of interesting because I always wonder, who is the cat and who is the mouse? Is it the professional that's the mouse, or is it the person coming looking for support? Now, to think a little bit about psychosexual development or sexual development, there's a whole host of things that contribute to that. And I'm going to do all those things a big injustice by trying to narrow them down to things that we can think about tonight. So this is a tiny snapshot. But I think our developmental story is really critical in terms of understanding our psychosexual person. So what are the situations, the people, the events that have occurred right throughout the life story that have shaped how we understand and how we view ourselves as sexual people? Personality factors are going to be very important in terms of that. The belief system that we hold is going to be really important in terms of dictating our attitudes and our values. And we absorb that in so many ways throughout our life from all the different experiences we have, the cultural and the social influences, learning social norms and mores, learning how to behave, what are sexual boundaries, etc., etc. Learning what it is to be male, what it is to be female, learning how we express that. There's various specific theories and understandings that are very helpful in trying to understand how we develop as sexual people. Consider emotional development. How we are emotionally is going to be very relevant for our sexual experience and our understanding of ourselves. Our cognitive development, our ability just to process and make sense of things and to understand the world and to understand ourselves, and our emotional intelligence alongside that. Social development, as I say, the people, the situation, the events, the family that we grow up in. What are the attitudes and the values towards sexuality in our home? What did we experience through our peers? What happened in school? What happened in our first love? What happened as we went on to become sexual beings? Physical development is another one that's very important. And to have an understanding of what this body that I have is about and how it functions and what's good for it and not good for it. What's good for it and not good for it in terms of sexual behaviour and sexual expression. And then there's attachment theory. And I'm sure you would be familiar with attachment theory, but it's one that I'm particularly wedded to, and it's one that I rely on a lot in building profiles with people about how they come to be where they're at today. I'm sure you're aware of attachment theory, but essentially what it gives to us is a way of understanding how we get a capacity for relationships as we go through life. And what the theory very simply says is that our way of being in relationship as adults is formed way back when we were infants and children. Now, what this theory highlights is that a child or an infant develops an understanding or a script of what it is to be in relationship with other people. And it happens through the bonding, the very powerful bonding that happens with the very first person who gives them care. That's usually mother, father, people who are very involved in the child's life. And through that, what happens is we learn that the world is a safe place, that the world is a predictable place, that there's going to be a constant source of heat and food and love and attention for us, and that we'll be okay. Now, that's a lot for a baby to be kind of processing, but that's actually what is being learned during those initial years of life. And arising from however this pans out for children, they develop a style of attaching or relating that's either secure or insecure. And as you can see, I've listed a few variations of the insecure attachment type. Now, what I really love about this theory is that it's so intuitive. In the very first years of our lives, our expectations, our understanding, our beliefs, our attitudes about what it means to relate to another person are set up. That's quite a lot of stuff that becomes established. And in the setting up of it, we develop a view of ourselves and of the world and how things work. And the fascinating part of this theory is that the research consistently shows, there's tons and tons and tons of research done on this over a long number of years. It consistently shows that the attachment style of childhood is the attachment style that somebody will have in an adult relationship. And why is that? Well, the attachment style from childhood informs and fuels the subsequent attachment or the subsequent developmental tasks that somebody goes through. So the emotional, the cognitive, the physical, the psychological development that they go through throughout the rest of their childhood and adolescence. So if you want to kind of get a handle on attachment, listen to people. Listen to the things that they'll say. You'll hear somebody say, "Do you know, I feel so comfortable around him. I know exactly where I stand with them." That's secure attachment. Or you'll hear somebody saying, "Nah, I don't really need to rely on people. I can do stuff for myself and I'm okay, thank you very much." Insecure type of attachment. I suppose the really important thing is that, if somebody goes on and develops an insecure attachment, that can be moderated or changed. It's not fixed. You're not stuck with that for life. So that corrective experiences, good relationships, really solid, decent people who love you coming into your life along the way can moderate and reshape the attachment style and effectively teach you how to be securely attached. Or for some people, therapy can be the way whereby they pick up that skill and ability. Through engaging in therapy and looking at their lives and understanding the pattern of attachment, they become able to understand themselves better and to make changes and to elect to do things in a different way. So, these are some of the tasks of sexual or psychosexual development as I see them. And I think, first and foremost, to integrate our own bodies, to integrate our bodies into our understanding of ourselves, to develop an awareness of our body and to develop a sense of sexual competence, to know how our bodies function from a sexual way. To identify and accept sexual orientation is a task. Because as we go through adolescence into adulthood, we start to recognize who we feel attracted to. And for some people, that's maybe a bit of a surprise. For some people, that might be outside the social norm. And there's adjusting and figuring out of that. But building a degree of comfort is important in it. To learn about sex and all the elements of it is really important. And one of the things that never ceases to amaze me, does it cease to amaze me? Maybe it's amazing me or less now, is the very, very poor level of sex knowledge and education that people have. And we live in an age where information is freely available, where we can access any information that we want. And it really blows me away that people do not have good basic sexual knowledge and awareness. And I think that's not something that's exclusive to older people. I see it in 20-somethings who come along believing they know what sex and sexuality is about, believing what they know what their bodies are about, and they don't really have solid, reliable, dependable information that's going to allow them to have a positive, healthy understanding of themselves as sexual beings. So learning, getting information, not being afraid to ask, not being afraid to go out and question something. And it does seem that there's a fair bit of bravado that we put forward in terms of our understanding of sexual stuff. Another element is to understand what sexual needs we have. If we're this sexual person, what do we need in order to be able to express that, in order to be able to live comfortably with that, in order to be able to relate with other people in a sexual way? And I'm not necessarily thinking of sexual contact with people, but so much of how we are in the world expresses our sexuality. And to be aware of that and to be comfortable with that. Establishing good sexual boundaries is something that's really important to learn. And when that goes wrong, it can go very badly wrong. And developing an understanding of what the sexual mores, what are the values of the people in our lives, what are the values of our community, what are the values of our culture and society, and to be able to find our feet within that. To flesh what I'm saying out a wee bit more, I want to introduce you to this fella, just a regular guy, a guy that I refer to as Mr. Happy Chappy. And what I'm interested in doing is just tracking some of the influences that have made him who he is today. Now, please forgive me if I do this in a really caricatured way, in a way that is simplistic and basic, but I'm just trying to highlight the developmental process in doing this. Now, it's a bit of a cliche for a psychologist to talk like this, but the early relationship that he had with his mother is something really very important for this guy. They managed to establish a strong bond, and that allowing him to experience the world as a very safe place where his needs are met in a consistent and constant kind of a way. And on the basis of that, he's able to go out as he grows a bit older and to establish regular friendships and relationships with his peers, just to hang out and play and do all the kiddie stuff. But his friends might be a bit of a pain at times. They might pinch him or break his toys or whatever. But he's able to tolerate that because his sense of the world is that this stuff's okay, we can manage. And more than that, he learns to say sorry whenever he gets things wrong, because he knows that the world isn't all about him. he moves on to school, and because things are going relatively well for him, he's able to cope with the challenge of school. He applies himself, and he has a kind of a can-do attitude, able to get on with people. Yeah, he might chance his arm and act a maggot at times, but he knows that his behaviour can have consequences and impact on others, so he's able to regulate himself and get himself back on track. Growing older, he establishes himself. His character begins to blossom. He explores the world, and he goes out and is able to express himself and do his thing. As this personality is becoming clearer and more self-assured. As he moves into his adult life, he is able to integrate with his community and do his study and do his work and do his thing, and able to have give and take with people, because he has a sense that people are okay, that they can be trusted, that he's going to be accepted. And if there's a bit of hassle along the way, he'll be able to call on support because he's comfortable enough to do that. He establishes his life more broadly. He gets interests and he does all the regular stuff, and he has peer group and he's interacting with people. I'm certainly not promoting Man United as the be-all and the end-all. But I suppose to show that he's just able to apply himself and engage with his world. And as he does all that, this guy becomes Mr. Happy Chappy. Solid, dependable, reliable, nice, decent. Far from perfect. But boy, do people love those qualities. So he's able to go off and form an intimate relationship. And he's able to form an attachment with somebody and establish a life, not a perfect life, not a perfect relationship, but one that works and that is good. So, if we move on and maybe flip the coin a little, and this chap I like to call Mr. Not So Happy Chappy. Now, he is just a regular guy too, with a regular life. But maybe things not quite settling so well as with our first chap. And again, I stress this is caricatured, so please don't hold me to ransom on it. And I'm trying to highlight just some of the variables in a person's developmental story and how they can go. But if we think about his first attachment, maybe that didn't go quite so well. It wasn't disastrous, it wasn't a bad attachment, but maybe he just didn't have that sense of his care being constant and secure and reliable and dependent. And because of that, he learns that, okay, maybe the world isn't such a safe place. For the most part it is, but there's wee periods where things don't quite add up. And I'm not entirely sure about people, or I'm not entirely sure about my place here. And so as he grows up into a wee boy, he's a little bit fearful, a little bit avoidant. And he doesn't tend towards hanging out with peers. He doesn't like them messing with his stuff because he's afraid it mightn't be there. Or he's a bit afraid that someone else might get a bit too much time over him. So it's easier for him to entertain himself and hang out on his own. He's quite contented in that. But I suppose setting up a pattern where he isn't learning the social interaction, where he isn't making the connections, where he isn't deepening a sense of, I'm me, this is who I am, this is what I want. School may have been a bit of a different experience too. Not quite the easy run as with our first guy, maybe a bit of bullying and stuff, all serving to unsettle him, to leave him a bit unsure about himself, and at a very vulnerable stage, late childhood into adolescence, having that sense of personal identity thwarted. So he doubts himself, maybe doesn't like himself so much, and is fearful and avoidant. But like anybody, he has things he wants to do, he has things he'd love to do, he has a way that he'd like to live his life. and he has dreams and hopes and desires, and he tries to put himself out there and to live, but it doesn't quite hit the spot for him. He misses the mark, gets things wrong, says the wrong thing sometimes, just feels that he struggles to find his place amongst his peer group and amongst his community. All of which drawing him into adulthood a little bit uncertain of himself, a little bit fearful of people, because remember he learned that they're not entirely dependable. Might not be exactly sure why they're not dependable, but just has that attitude or that sense. And so he's avoidant and withdraws and tends to do things on his own, leaving him feeling a bit glum, a bit blue, and a bit on his own. Now, in terms of development and the kind of issues that I'm suggesting are important to consider, think about attachment with our first fella. Secure, emotional health and well-being, good awareness of himself, all the other elements falling into place. If we put that alongside Mr. Not So Happy, then we can see the distinctions. The developmental process not quite falling into place in the same way, and the ground being sown for some challenges, for some difficulties as he goes through life. So thinking then, what is the benefit of having positive, healthy sexual expression or understanding of ourselves? Well, it allows us to feel a sense of fulfillment. It allows us to explore and express ourselves in a way that is meaningful. It gives us pleasure at so many different levels. It allows us to be spontaneous and playful. And the research really shores this up, it brings lots of positive emotion if we have a sense of integrated sexuality. It allows us to develop intimacy, meaning in our lives. And I suppose there's that feeling that we all know, I'm sure, where we just feel life is good. Healthy sexuality, positive sexuality, is good for society as well. It has definitely got an impact on mental health and well-being. It helps to reduce conflicts between people. It reduces and has an impact on sexual and violent crimes. And it's a way of targeting exploitation that can come about where sexuality is abused or taken for granted. One of the things that's very obvious is that sexual development doesn't happen in nice, neat, straight line. All our stories are unique. All our stories are coloured along the way with different experiences, some good, some a bit challenging, some maybe not so good. So things do not happen in straight lines in terms of life, and certainly in terms of our sexual lives at times. And for some, it can feel a bit more like this, where they feel tied up in knots. They're not sure how to untangle things. They're not sure where the start of the knot is or how the end of it is or how to begin to unpick it. And I suppose in my own work, what I've experienced is people coming along where their lives are feeling a little bit like this, where there is some sexual difficulty that has really left them feeling in a jam, where they're feeling very compromised and unable to cope and unable to proceed. Now, I think that is a real shame that it gets to this. I mentioned earlier about the reluctance of professionals to talk about issues. I absolutely believe that for certain people, that if there was a free discussion able to happen, that the knots wouldn't come about. And that's a real shame. So you can see why I'm willing to take up the mic at any opportunity, where I'm willing to go and talk to my colleagues and to highlight this and to try and get training in places in different venues so that these knots won't become. Prevention is really important. Having simple, straightforward conversations, sharing information, allowing people to express and understand themselves is so critical. Unfortunately, the reality is that these knots do come along. When the knots occur for people, when they find themselves experiencing sexual difficulties, there's been a variety of ways that that's been managed over the years. Initially, these things were seen purely as medical problems and were treated as such. And issues that are very clearly in the psychological domain would have been medicated, and, of course, resolution not coming. But fortunately, things started to change, and, over to the Americans for that. I'm sure you're familiar with the Masters and Johnson, the television program, Masters of Sex. They were really pioneering in terms of saying, here, listen, we've got to do this differently. This just is not working. And they devised various approaches, some of which still stack up today and are still used today, some of which were off the wall. But what they did was, I think they gave permission to start thinking about these things in a different way. And various other people came after them, right up until today, where there is a very much holistic perspective taken. Back to my diagram from the start, that circle with the slices of pie, where the whole person, their whole experience is relevant in understanding how sexual difficulties can arise and cause people difficulties. These are some of the ways that sexuality can become challenged, and these are some of the ways that people present in our service, where people have indiscriminate sexual behaviour, where they're not able to regulate their behaviour, where it becomes out of control and it becomes distressing for them or for other people. Sexual dysfunctions, issues around sexual desire, which is a huge issue and probably one of the biggest issues whenever we get underneath the story for people. Issues of arousal, etc. And I think this is the area where medications that people might be on for mental health can have an implication. It can be really distressing and really hard for people sometimes to say to their doctor, there's a bit of a problem with this medication. And think of the whole important aspect of life that becomes sidelined. Sexual paraphilias, where people have an interest in various sexual objects or practices, or sexual behaviours that distress, that impact on other people, and that moves into the internet side of things. This is the service that we have in St. John of God Hospital, which is a dedicated psychology service to help people to try and establish positive, meaningful, helpful, healthy sexual relationships. The kind of things that we do are these, but primarily our work is about providing assessment and therapy to help people to understand, to help people to move on, to help people to integrate. One of the things that really kind of delights me is that about 20% of the people that I would see I would see them for one, maybe two sessions. And what these people typically need is a conversation, is a normalizing response, saying, that's okay. What's your worry there? Just giving them permission to take themselves on board and say, it's okay. Or giving a bit of information, just letting them know some information that is actually quite transforming. Like what I do isn't rocket science, but it's just daring to do it in a community that struggles to do it. I want to talk a little bit about some aspects of the internet and what that means and how we experience that, how we interact with that, and how we apply ourselves to that. Now, these are some of the issues that come up in relation to the internet in its broad sense. I'm not going to develop any of them in particular, but I think you can see how any of these would impact on someone's mental health. I met someone recently whose life was going along perfectly okay, who was living a good life, And that life was completely thrown upside down to a point where their career became compromised because of a blog that somebody was writing and decided to write stuff about them that was absolutely false. Cyberbullying is all around us, and it's impacting on people in a really, really profound way. Facebook depression, another one I refer to there. Looking at Facebook, at all the fun that our friends are having while I'm sat at home. They're all out again, or so-and-so met up with so-and-so. And there is this growing phenomenon where people are reading Facebook and becoming consumed by it and can't stop looking at it, or whatever the social media app it is, and they cannot give up on it. And they're judging themselves, and they're implicating their mental health as a result of this. But nobody posts about that. The good stuff goes up, and it's the good stuff that seems to sting whenever we're a bit vulnerable. In this model, I'm trying to express what happens for us when we engage with social media, when we engage with the internet, in a way that distracts us and that takes our attention gradually further and further away from our regular lives. And starting out with this idea of intermittent detachment. Now, if my phone went, it's not in my pocket, if my phone went and buzzed in my pocket, I would become focused on that for a moment. My attention would go to it. If any of your phones went, there would be probably a stronger inclination for you to look down and say, oh, who's come in now? And go into it, and I'll reply when I'm at it. And we detach a little bit from what we're doing in the moment. Now, that in and of itself isn't a disaster, because we multitask and we do different things all the time. I suppose in relation to technology and internet, whenever that becomes a pattern, what can evolve is this idea of continuous partial detachment. Now, we all know the continually partially detached person. They're the person who's talking to you and they're texting and they're showing you something from Facebook and the conversation gets interrupted, and then they're off and they're checking an email and they're doing something else, and they're in and out, dipping in and out of the conversation. Sit in a restaurant, look around you. The bulk of tables will have phones sitting on the table and people will be dipping in and out. For the most of us, that's not a big issue. But for some, there's a growing pattern of this continuous partial detachment, never quite getting the attention of somebody fully. I remember a woman talking about being with her boyfriend and saying how she found that, he was constantly on this buzz of emails, updating Facebook, going to Twitter, and not engaging with her. And she said that one evening they came out of the cinema and he was focused on putting up about the movie they'd seen and writing a comment about that, and he didn't discuss the movie with her. That's continuous partial detachment, because what's happening is there's a stepping back from the real engagement with real people in your life, and there's an increasing reliance on the virtual. The consequence of that over time, and I've started to see this more and more in how people present, is what talk about as an enduring intimacy difficulty, where people lose that ability to have an emotional connection, where they lose the ability to connect with the person that they're sitting with or the person who's the significant other in their lives or their friends, because their attention has become wrapped up in the phone, the tablet, whatever it is. Now then, that's a real problem. One of the big areas where I see that emerging in my work and where I see mental health really compromised is with young men who are viewing increasing amounts of pornography and who are getting lost in that world. And one of the effects of it for them is that their sexual expression goes into the pornography. They identify with the people that they're viewing in the pornography. They become consumed with that. And they are immensely satisfied at that level because the volume and the expanse of different pornography to be viewed is vast. Then they start to experience erectile difficulties, intimacy difficulties, and it has quite a significant effect on their sense of themselves and of their ability to be able to relate. I've seen it where it starts to impact on their ability to engage in work. So, really significant problem. These are some of the things, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk through them all, but some of the things that I see as impacts under different categories of internet and social media. But maybe just to highlight the social implications and the psychological implications. As you look at those, isolation, loneliness, disconnection, depersonalized relationships, relationship fidelity or infidelity, compulsivity, intimacy disrupted. Just consider what is the effect of that going to be on someone's mental health. What is the effect of that going to be on how someone views themselves in relationship, views their ability to connect and to engage? This stuff pings and ricochets all over the place. The porn issue. I read an interesting statistic done by the Internet Review Institute from earlier this year, which said that there are 4.2 billion porn websites. It's a fair bit of porn, isn't it? 68 million searches online every day are porn related. 68 million. And that's 25% of all internet searches. So there's a pretty pervasive thing happening online here. Now, some people will say, what's the issue? And I don't come at this from a moralistic perspective. I'm coming at this from a psychological perspective where I see the implications of this for people's well-being, for their mental health, and for their ability to engage in meaningful, appropriate kind of lifestyles for themselves. Now, this guy, Patrick Carnes, who is the expert in the world around porn and porn addiction, did a very comprehensive survey of about 9,000 people back in 2001. It's quite old now, so it would be interesting to see where these figures are at today. But he described that of the 9,000, that about 84% were what were described as recreational users, people who dipped in and out, where it wasn't having any impact on their sense of themselves or on their ability to relate and connect or their sexual relationships. But 10% were compulsive users. That's a lot of people. 900 people out of 1,000, or out of 9,000. It's a lot of people compulsively viewing pornography. Now, if you think on what I'm talking about in terms of continual emotional detachment, these people are going to be in that territory. Of the 9,000, 6% were considered to be at-risk users. So people whose use of pornography was really actively impacting on their relationships, on their sense of themselves, on their ability to be sexual. And I would imagine that within that 6%, there were people who were very much in the grey area in terms of the legality of their behaviour. So, 16% of this sample vulnerable. You would have to think that with the explosion of smartphones, with the ease of access of the internet, with 4G and all the rest of it, that these figures are a bit outdated and a bit old hat at this stage. Now, I certainly wouldn't for one be saying that these figures are likely to have reduced. I think it can only have accentuated this issue. So, the research would be showing that there's a significant issue here. My clinical practice absolutely, without a doubt, shows that there's a significant issue here. And yet we say, everybody does it. What's the hassle? I was really annoyed at the recent Donald Trump issue where he made those comments, or that those comments were exposed. That he said them was one thing, but the response that he gave was a kind of, sure, everybody does it. And he normalised very abusive commentary and said that for a 60-year-old that it's okay to be saying this kind of a thing. And that really, I found that quite shocking, because that's the everybody does it attitude. What happens whenever people are viewing porn? It becomes a friend, it becomes a sexual partner, but porn isn't benign. Some people, yes, can dip in and out, but it is not a benign present. It's not a harmless present. It impacts. And some of the telltale signs for people where this might be impacting is if the red eye syndrome, as I call it, people sitting up watching pornography for hours on end, tired the next day, unable to do their work, unable to engage with people. People becoming preoccupied, wanting to stop, not able to stop. Where there's a big personal cost, where there's a fallout on a bus stop because somebody realised that this has been going on and a relationship is impacted. I'm going to finish very shortly, but what I put up this slide to conclude, and it's a slide from a really good organisation, EU Kids Online. And they do tons of research all across Europe looking at the use of internet among children. And the question they asked was, what are the things that bother you online? Now, I'm not sure if you can read those comments, but to me they're pretty frightening. Porn websites, information on how to be anorexic, graphic images, bullying, racism, death by beating. How have we got to the point where we're asking children to tell us this sort of stuff that they're seeing online? How have we got to the point where we can receive this information and not be scared silly? And not be making really strong stand in terms of looking very seriously at what's happening with our internet use. Looking very seriously at how we manage the use of internet with children. And my experience is that we're quite blasé in terms of what children are allowed to view. And I say that, and I say it with concern, because we don't know what the effects of this will be for children. But the indications that I'm seeing in my clinic is that this is going to hurt, and it's going to hurt bad. And I think for a proportion of our population, there are mental health problems, there are psychological problems in the making, and we're adopting the attitude, sure, everyone's doing it. Thank you.